Hey guys, tonight we journey back to the frozen shores of early America, to a place where hope arrived on wooden ships and desperation settled in with the winter winds. Imagine spending months crossing an endless ocean only to find yourself surrounded by swamps, disease, hunger, and uncertainty. Tonight, we follow the settlers of Jamestown through one of the most frightening winters in colonial history, a season so harsh that many who entered it never lived to see spring. So settle in, relax, and let the story carry you back more than 400 years. In the spring of 1607, 3 English ships slowly approached the coastline of what is now Virginia. The vessels had spent months battling storms, rough seas, and the many discomforts of a transatlantic voyage. On board were more than 100 settlers sent by the Virginia Company of London. Their mission was simple on paper, but incredibly difficult in reality. They were expected to establish a permanent English settlement, search for valuable resources, and create a profitable colony for investors back home. As the travelers entered the broad waters of the Chesapeake Bay, many believed they were witnessing the beginning of a promising future. The land appeared rich and green. Rivers stretched deep into the interior. Forests seemed endless. Compared to crowded England, this new world looked full of opportunity. The settlers eventually selected a small peninsula along a river they named after King James. The settlement itself became known as Jamestown. At first glance, the location seemed useful. Ships could anchor nearby. The waterway allowed transportation and communication. The peninsula also appeared easier to defend from possible attacks by rival European powers. Yet beneath the surface, serious problems already existed. The area was surrounded by marshland. Mosquitoes thrived there during warm months. The river water was often brackish and unsuitable for drinking. During dry periods, salt water moved farther inland, contaminating freshwater supplies. Disease spread quickly in such conditions. Many of the settlers were not farmers or laborers. A considerable number came from wealthier backgrounds and had little experience growing food, constructing shelters, or surviving in a wilderness environment. Some dreamed of finding gold rather than planting crops. Others expected native populations to provide assistance whenever necessary. Reality proved far less forgiving. The first months were filled with hard labor. Trees had to be cut. Fortifications needed construction. Housing remained inadequate. Food supplies dwindled faster than expected. The unfamiliar climate created additional challenges. Meanwhile, the colony existed within the territory of a powerful Native American political alliance led by Chief Powhatan. This confederation included numerous communities spread throughout the region. Initial encounters varied from cautious trade to moments of tension. Both sides were uncertain about the intentions of the other. As summer deepened, sickness began spreading through the settlement. Many colonists suffered from contaminated water, poor nutrition, and diseases carried by insects. The heat added to their misery. Death became increasingly common. Men who had imagined riches now found themselves digging graves. The colony's population shrank rapidly. Some accounts suggest that nearly half the settlers died during the first months alone. Yet Jamestown somehow survived. Leadership struggles emerged almost immediately. Different individuals argued over priorities and strategy. The colony's governing council frequently disagreed. Amid these disputes, one figure gradually became more important. His name was Captain John Smith. Smith had experienced adventures across Europe before arriving in Virginia. He possessed a practical mindset and understood that survival required work rather than wishful thinking. He encouraged exploration, negotiated with native groups, and pushed colonists to contribute labor. One of his most famous principles could be summarized simply: those who did not work should not expect to eat. Although not everyone appreciated his strict approach, it helped stabilize the struggling settlement. Over time, Smith organized expeditions along rivers and waterways, gathering information about the region. These journeys revealed both opportunities and dangers. The surrounding landscape was vast, beautiful, and often unpredictable. Forests stretched across rolling terrain. Deer moved quietly through the trees. Rivers reflected changing skies. Yet, every expedition carried risks from weather, unfamiliar terrain, and potential conflict. As autumn approached, survival remained uncertain. The settlers needed food stores for winter. Crops had not produced enough. Trade with nearby native communities became increasingly important. Through negotiation and exchange, the English obtained corn and other supplies that temporarily eased shortages. Still, dependence on outside assistance carried obvious risks. If trade stopped, hunger would return quickly. The colony also remained vulnerable because many settlers lacked essential skills. Some continued searching for precious metals instead of helping secure food reserves. Others underestimated how severe winter conditions could become. Back in England, many people imagined Virginia as a place of abundance. Promotional materials often highlighted fertile land and economic opportunity. Investors hoped for profits. Potential settlers heard stories of possibility. Few understood the daily hardships facing those already living there. Inside Jamestown, every meal mattered. Every barrel of grain was counted. Every hunting trip carried importance. Every illness threatened not just an individual, but the survival of the entire community. As leaves began changing color across the forests, uncertainty settled over the settlement like an approaching fog. The colonists repaired structures and strengthened defenses. Some remained optimistic. Others quietly feared what colder months might bring. John Smith continued pushing for preparation. He understood that winter could expose every weakness the colony possessed. Food shortages, poor shelter, internal disagreements, and strained relations with neighboring communities could combine into a dangerous situation. Unfortunately, events soon moved in a direction few could control. During one of Smith's expeditions in 1609, he suffered a serious injury caused by an accidental gunpowder explosion. The wound forced him to return to England for medical treatment. His departure created a leadership vacuum at exactly the wrong moment. Without Smith's firm influence, old rivalries resurfaced. Decision-making became less effective. Discipline weakened. At the same time, relations between the English and Powhatan Confederacy deteriorated. Trade became more difficult. Trust diminished. Food grew scarcer. The colony entered the final months of 1609 facing challenges on nearly every front. Additional settlers had arrived from England, increasing the number of mouths requiring food. Unfortunately, supplies were already inadequate. Expectations exceeded available resources. As temperatures gradually dropped, signs of trouble multiplied. Game became harder to find. Stored provisions declined. Work slowed. Anxiety spread through the settlement. Many colonists still hoped relief ships would arrive carrying fresh supplies from England. Such hopes were understandable. The Atlantic crossing was difficult, but support remained essential if the colony was to survive. Yet the ocean often ignored human schedules. Storms disrupted voyages. Ships disappeared. Deliveries arrived late. Weeks passed, then more weeks followed. The settlers looked toward the river and horizon, waiting. Winter was approaching, and Jamestown was not ready. The cold winds that swept through the settlement during late 1609 carried more than falling temperatures. They carried the first whispers of what future generations would remember as the starving time. Before long, the settlers would face conditions so desperate that even the strongest assumptions about civilization, morality, and endurance would be tested. For now, however, the people of Jamestown could only watch the days grow shorter, count their dwindling food supplies, and wonder whether help would reach them before winter closed its icy grip around the colony. By late 1609, Jamestown had entered a state where normal expectations of survival no longer applied in any stable way. The settlement, already strained by years of uncertainty, now began to collapse inward under the weight of food shortages, weakened leadership, and a harsh winter that arrived faster than anyone seemed prepared for. The ships that colonists had long been waiting for did not arrive on time. Messages from England promised relief, but the Atlantic Ocean was a barrier that did not respond to urgency. Storms delayed voyages. Navigation errors sent ships off course, and in some cases, supply missions simply failed without clear explanation. Inside Jamestown, however, none of those reasons mattered. What mattered was that storage rooms were nearly empty. Hunting became increasingly unproductive, and the small farms that existed produced far less than what was needed. As November turned into December, the situation worsened in visible ways. The river that once seemed like a lifeline became a cold, gray stretch of water that brought no new help. The wind cut through poorly built wooden structures. Food rations were reduced again and again, until even the smallest portions felt inadequate for sustaining strength. Inside the settlement, daily life narrowed into a repetitive cycle of searching, waiting, and enduring. Men who once believed they were building a prosperous colony now spent their time scouring nearby forests for anything edible. Tree bark, roots, and small animals became increasingly important. Some expeditions returned empty-handed, forcing leaders to divide already limited supplies even further. The social structure of Jamestown also began to shift under pressure. In earlier months, disagreements had mostly been about strategy or leadership direction. Now, those disagreements became more immediate and personal, often centered around survival itself. Trust weakened as hunger increased. People began to guard their portions carefully. Sharing became less frequent, not because of cruelty alone, but because scarcity reshaped behavior. At the center of this fragile system was a colony that no longer had enough stability to function in a coordinated way. The absence of strong leadership made the situation even more difficult. With Captain John Smith gone, decision-making became inconsistent. Temporary leaders attempted to maintain order, but authority was fragmented. Some decisions contradicted others. Instructions changed frequently, creating confusion among settlers who were already exhausted. As winter fully arrived, conditions inside Jamestown deteriorated sharply. Cold temperatures combined with poor shelter created constant discomfort. Many homes were little more than wooden frames, with gaps that allowed wind and moisture to enter freely. Firewood became essential, but increasingly difficult to gather. The effort required to collect it often cost more energy than the warmth it provided. Food shortages soon reached a critical level. Stored grain was exhausted faster than anticipated. Animals in the surrounding area became scarce due to overhunting and natural migration patterns. Fishing attempts were hindered by freezing water and limited equipment. Even previously reliable sources of sustenance became unreliable. By early 1610, the colony entered what later accounts would describe as its most severe phase, often referred to as the starving time. During this period, survival was no longer a matter of comfort or hardship. It became a matter of whether individuals would live through the week. Mortality increased rapidly. People weakened by hunger became more susceptible to illness. Simple infections turned dangerous. Physical exhaustion meant that even basic tasks required immense effort. Walking short distances could leave individuals fatigued. The psychological impact was equally significant. Hunger affected judgment and mood. Conversations became shorter and more focused on immediate needs. Hope, which had once been a driving force for the colony's existence, became harder to maintain. Some settlers attempted to continue normal routines, but normality itself had dissolved. Attempts were made to negotiate or obtain food through trade with nearby native communities, but relations had become strained over time. Earlier conflicts, misunderstandings, and shifting alliances meant that consistent cooperation was no longer possible. Without reliable external support, Jamestown was left to rely almost entirely on its own depleted resources. As weeks passed, the population declined further. Burial sites expanded beyond their earlier boundaries. The ground became harder to work due to cold weather, making burial processes more difficult and slower. In some cases, desperation forced the living to prioritize survival tasks over traditional practices. Inside the settlement, survivors began to divide into smaller groups. These groups formed around proximity, necessity, and shared circumstances rather than formal organization. Movement between groups was limited, and communication became minimal. The colony, in effect, fragmented into isolated clusters of individuals trying to endure the same crisis in different ways. Food scarcity reached such extremes that reports from later accounts describe behavior that reflected the breakdown of ordinary social norms. While the exact details vary depending on the source, historians agree that desperation pushed some individuals to actions that would have been unthinkable during normal conditions. These accounts remain one of the most disturbing aspects of Jamestown's early history, illustrating the extreme pressures faced during that winter. By spring of 1610, fewer than a fraction of the original settlers remained alive. Those who survived were physically weakened and mentally exhausted. Clothing had deteriorated. Strength had diminished. Even simple recovery from the winter's conditions required significant time. And yet, despite everything, Jamestown did not completely disappear. In a dramatic turn of events, a small group of survivors prepared to abandon the settlement entirely. They boarded ships in an attempt to return to England, believing the colony had failed beyond recovery. As they traveled downriver toward the open sea, they encountered incoming relief ships carrying supplies and new leadership. This unexpected meeting changed the course of the colony's future. The survivors were ordered to turn back. Fresh provisions were brought ashore. Leadership was reorganized once again, this time with stricter structure and clearer objectives. Jamestown, which had come within days of being permanently abandoned, was given a second chance. However, the memory of the winter remained deeply embedded in the experience of those who lived through it. It stood as a reminder of how quickly ambition can collapse under environmental pressure, poor planning, and human conflict. The colony would continue, but it would never forget the season when survival itself became uncertain. And as the survivors looked back on the frozen months they had endured, one truth remained clear. The winter had not only tested Jamestown's resources, it had tested the limits of human endurance in a place that offered no mercy to the unprepared. The arrival of relief did not erase what had already happened in Jamestown. It only prevented the settlement from vanishing completely. The survivors who turned their ships around and returned to the colony stepped back onto land that carried the weight of everything that had taken place during the winter. The air itself seemed unchanged, but the people were. What remained of the settlement was fragile. Buildings still stood, but many were in poor condition. Storage areas had been emptied so completely that even basic reconstruction required immediate resupply. The population was drastically reduced, and those who survived carried visible signs of prolonged hardship. Weakness was not just physical, it had become part of their daily rhythm. The incoming relief brought supplies, but more importantly, it brought structure. New leadership arrived with stricter rules and a clearer sense of direction. The previous cycle of confusion and competing authority was no longer sustainable. The colony needed order more than anything else, and for a time, that need reshaped every decision. Food distribution was reorganized first. Instead of inconsistent rationing, supplies were now controlled under centralized oversight. This did not eliminate scarcity, but it reduced chaos. People no longer had to guess whether food would appear or disappear depending on the day's circumstances. Predictability, even in small amounts, became a stabilizing force. Rebuilding efforts began immediately. Structures damaged by winter winds were repaired or replaced. Storage buildings were reinforced. Efforts were made to improve defenses as well, not because an attack was imminent, but because the previous years had demonstrated how vulnerable the settlement was to both internal collapse and external pressure. Yet even as physical repairs progressed, emotional recovery lagged behind. Those who lived through the winter carried memories that could not be rebuilt or reinforced in the same way as wooden walls. The experience had reshaped how people viewed the land, their mission, and each other. Trust within the community remained cautious. Survivors who had witnessed extreme deprivation remembered how quickly social bonds had weakened when food disappeared. As a result, cooperation in the early recovery period was practical rather than emotional. People worked together because they had to, not necessarily because they fully trusted one another. The colony's relationship with surrounding native communities also entered a new phase. Earlier interactions had been inconsistent, marked by periods of trade, tension, and conflict. After the winter, Both sides approached each other with a clearer understanding of consequences. The English settlers, weakened by experience, could no longer assume dominance or easy access to resources. Native groups, aware of the colony's instability, adjusted their own strategies accordingly. Trade resumed in limited forms, but it was more controlled and conditional than before. Corn, fish, and other essential goods were exchanged carefully. Both sides understood that survival in the region required a degree of balance, even if that balance was uneasy. Inside Jamestown, attention gradually shifted from immediate survival to long-term stability. Leaders began considering how to prevent another collapse of similar scale. The harsh lesson of the winter had made one thing clear. Without preparation, planning, and discipline, the colony could not sustain itself. Agriculture became a central focus. Unlike earlier periods where farming had been inconsistent or undervalued, it now received structured attention. Fields were expanded and reorganized. More settlers were assigned to planting and harvesting roles. Even those who had previously resisted manual labor were required to participate in maintaining food production. Over time, these changes began to produce results. Harvests improved. Storage systems became more reliable. Although shortages did not disappear entirely, the colony was no longer living at the edge of immediate collapse. Leadership continued to evolve as well. Authority was increasingly tied to practicality rather than status or ambition. Those who could maintain order and deliver results gained influence. Those who could not gradually lost it. This shift helped reduce some of the earlier conflicts that had weakened the colony during its first years. Still, progress was uneven. Jamestown remained vulnerable to external conditions, disease, and economic pressure from investors in England. The Virginia Company continued to expect returns from the colony, creating tension between profitability and survival. Settlers were often caught between what was needed locally and what was demanded from abroad. Despite these pressures, the colony persisted. The memory of the winter served as both warning and motivation. It reminded settlers that survival could not be taken for granted. Yet, it also demonstrated that survival was possible even under extreme conditions. That dual lesson shaped future decisions in subtle but lasting ways. As years passed, Jamestown slowly transformed. It was no longer just a precarious experiment struggling against the environment. It became a more structured settlement with growing agricultural output, expanding trade networks, and increasingly defined social systems. However, the scars of the early winter never fully disappeared. They remained embedded in the colony's identity, passed down through stories and accounts of those who endured it. New arrivals would hear fragments of what had happened, stories of hunger, cold, and near abandonment. And those stories shaped expectations before they even set foot in the settlement. The early years of Jamestown became a defining chapter in the broader history of English colonization in North America. They revealed how fragile early attempts at settlement could be, and how quickly ambition could be tested by environment and reality. In time, Jamestown would continue to evolve, playing a significant role in the development of colonial Virginia. But the winter of hardship remained its most defining moment, a period when the future of the entire experiment hung in balance, and when survival itself was uncertain. And even long after the colony stabilized, the memory of that season lingered like a shadow in its foundations, a reminder that the land did not yield easily, and that every step forward had been paid for with struggle. Jamestown's recovery after the devastating winter did not mean a return to comfort or stability in any simple sense. Instead, it marked the beginning of a long and uneven rebuilding process, where every improvement had to be earned through labor, adaptation, and constant negotiation with an environment that remained indifferent to human plans. As the colony stabilized, attention shifted outward again. The land that had once seemed promising but unpredictable was now being studied with far greater seriousness. Settlers who had survived the starvation period no longer held romantic ideas about Virginia. They understood the region in practical terms. Rivers could be useful but unreliable. Forests could provide food but also conceal danger. And seasons could determine survival more than any human authority. Agricultural expansion became the central pillar of survival strategy. Fields were cleared farther from the original settlement, and planting routines became more organized. Unlike the earlier chaotic attempts at farming, where expectations were high but execution inconsistent, this new phase involved careful planning and repetition. Corn, beans, and other crops were prioritized not for profit, but for stability. This shift in mindset was one of the most important consequences of the winter. Before the crisis, many settlers still carried the belief that Virginia might quickly yield wealth through discovery or extraction. After the crisis, survival itself became the primary measure of success. Gold and rapid profit were no longer realistic expectations for most of those who remained. Labor systems also evolved during this period. Work was no longer optional or loosely organized. It became structured into assigned duties with greater emphasis on collective responsibility. Those who failed to contribute were increasingly pressured or forced into participation, not as a matter of punishment alone, but because the colony could no longer afford inactivity. The physical layout of Jamestown gradually changed as well. Early structures built in haste were replaced with more durable designs. Storage facilities were reinforced to prevent spoilage and loss. Defensive structures were adjusted not because of a single specific threat, but because experience had shown that unpredictability itself was the greatest risk factor. At the same time, the colony's relationship with its surroundings, continued to evolve. The surrounding indigenous communities were no longer viewed through simplistic assumptions of either hostility or assistance. Instead, interactions became more transactional and situational. Trade agreements were made when mutually beneficial, and tensions were managed carefully to avoid repeating earlier cycles of breakdown. These interactions were shaped by a mutual awareness of vulnerability. The winter had demonstrated that the English settlement could fail completely under pressure. Native communities, while far more established in the region, also navigated shifting alliances and resource pressures of their own. As a result, neither side could afford to ignore the other entirely. Inside the colony, a quieter transformation was taking place in the mindset of the survivors. Those who had lived through the starvation period carried an internal memory that influenced every decision. Food was no longer treated casually. Storage habits became more cautious. Waste was minimized wherever possible. Even in times of relative abundance, the fear of scarcity remained present in collective memory. New arrivals from England often struggled to understand this mindset at first. They came with expectations shaped by promotional accounts that still circulated abroad, describing Virginia as a land of opportunity and potential wealth. Upon arrival, however, they encountered a very different reality, one shaped by labor demands, strict organization, and the lingering caution of survivors who had already experienced collapse. This difference in expectations sometimes created tension within the colony. Experienced settlers, hardened by survival, often viewed newcomers as unprepared or overly optimistic. New arrivals, in turn, sometimes saw established colonists as overly strict or pessimistic. Over time, however, these groups gradually adjusted to one another, though not without friction. Economically, Jamestown also began to shift from pure survival towards structured production. Tobacco cultivation, which would later become central to the colony's economy, started to gain importance during this broader period of development. While not yet fully dominant, it offered a more reliable export than earlier attempts at mining or speculative resource gathering. This development introduced new complexities. While tobacco provided economic potential, it also increased dependence on land use and labor. The colony's survival strategy, once focused primarily on food security, began to expand into broader economic ambitions once again. This dual focus, survival and profit, created ongoing tension in decision-making. Despite these emerging challenges, the colony's foundation was stronger than it had been during its earliest years. The winter had acted as a brutal filter, removing many of the weakest structures, assumptions, and approaches. What remained was not perfect, but it was more resilient. Yet even resilience had limits. Jamestown remained dependent on supply lines from England, vulnerable to disease outbreaks, and subject to the shifting policies of investors and governing bodies abroad. Every improvement in local stability had to be balanced against external uncertainty. Still, compared to the fragile settlement that nearly collapsed during the starving time, the colony had undergone a profound transformation. It was no longer simply surviving month to month. It was slowly building systems that allowed it to persist across seasons and years. The memory of the winter continued to function as a warning embedded in the colony's identity. It influenced governance, labor expectations, and attitudes toward risk. It reminded settlers that conditions could deteriorate faster than anticipated, and that preparation was not optional. Over time, Jamestown's story became one of endurance shaped by hardship. The winter was not just an isolated event in its early history. It became a reference point that defined everything that came after it. It marked the boundary between fragile experiment and sustained settlement, and though generations would pass, and the colony would continue to change in ways those early survivors could not have imagined, the lessons of that season would remain fixed in its foundation. Survival in a new world required more than ambition. It required adaptation, discipline, and the ability to endure when hope itself felt uncertain. As Jamestown moved further away from its earliest years, the settlement slowly began to resemble something more structured than the fragile outpost it once was. The harsh lessons of the winter were no longer immediate memories for every inhabitant, but they continued to shape the colony's systems in subtle and lasting ways. Even those who had not lived through the worst of the starvation period inherited its consequences through rules, habits, and warnings passed down from older settlers. The physical environment around Jamestown remained unchanged in its core nature. The same river still flowed past the settlement, carrying with it both opportunity and risk. The same forests still stretched outward, offering resources, but also unpredictability. What had changed was the way people approached these surroundings. There was less assumption, less carelessness, and far more caution in every decision involving land, food, and labor. One of the most important developments in this period was the increasing importance of agriculture as the foundation of survival. Farming was no longer treated as a secondary activity behind exploration or trade. Instead, it became the central system around which the colony's existence revolved. Fields expanded gradually beyond the original settlement, requiring more organized labor and longer-term planning. This expansion did not happen smoothly. It required constant adjustment to soil conditions, weather patterns, and labor availability. Some seasons brought strong harvests, while others created setbacks that reminded settlers how fragile their progress still was. Even with improved organization, the colony remained vulnerable to droughts, floods, and unpredictable climate shifts. Yet compared to the chaos of earlier years, these challenges were now being managed rather than simply endured. Labor organization became more formalized as well. Tasks were assigned with greater consistency, and expectations for daily work became clearer. This structure helped reduce the disorder that had previously contributed to shortages and inefficiency. While not everyone agreed with the increasing rigidity, it provided the stability the colony needed to avoid repeating its earlier collapse. The leadership of Jamestown also continued to evolve. Authority was increasingly tied to practical results rather than social background or ambition alone. Leaders who could maintain order, ensure food production, and manage trade relationships gained influence. Those who could not adapt gradually lost their position. This shift reflected a broader transformation in the colony's priorities, from exploration-driven optimism to survival-driven realism. At the same time, the colony's external relationships remained complex. Interactions with surrounding native communities continued through cycles of trade, negotiation, and occasional conflict. These relationships were no longer shaped by simple expectations of dominance or dependence. Instead, they reflected a more complicated balance where both sides understood the consequences of instability. Trade remained essential for survival, especially in years when harvests were uncertain. Corn and other resources obtained through exchange often determined whether the colony could sustain itself through difficult seasons. However, these exchanges also required careful diplomacy, as trust had been weakened by earlier periods of tension and misunderstanding. Inside the settlement, the memory of the winter continued to influence daily behavior. Even as conditions improved, there remained a cautious approach to consumption and storage. Food was managed carefully, waste was minimized, and reserves were maintained whenever possible. This mindset created a cultural shift that persisted long after immediate scarcity had passed. New settlers arriving from England often noticed this difference immediately. They came with expectations shaped by distant reports and promotional claims, only to encounter a society that had been fundamentally reshaped by hardship. For them, Jamestown was not an untouched opportunity, but a functioning, disciplined settlement shaped by experience. This contrast sometimes led to friction. Established settlers, shaped by survival, often viewed newcomers as inexperienced or overly optimistic. New arrivals, in turn, sometimes struggled to understand the strict routines and cautious attitudes they encountered. Over time, however, these differences gradually softened as shared work and shared conditions created mutual understanding. Economically, the colony continued its gradual shift toward more sustainable production systems. Tobacco cultivation expanded further, becoming an increasingly important export. This crop provided a more reliable economic foundation than earlier speculative ventures, helping the colony connect more firmly to international trade networks. However, this economic development also introduced new dependencies. The success of tobacco tied the colony more closely to market demand and external trade systems. While it improved financial stability, it also meant that Jamestown was no longer only dependent on survival conditions, but also on economic fluctuations far beyond its control. Despite these complexities, the overall direction of the colony was one of gradual stabilization. The extreme vulnerability of the early years had been reduced, even if not eliminated entirely. Systems for food production, labor organization, and trade were now more resilient than before. Still, the environment remained an ever-present factor in the colony's existence. Weather could still disrupt harvests. Disease could still spread quickly in dense settlements. Supply disruptions from England could still create shortages. Jamestown had become more stable, but it was never fully secure. The legacy of the winter remained embedded in this reality. It served as a permanent reminder that conditions could change rapidly, and that survival depended on preparation rather than assumption. It shaped how leaders planned, how settlers worked, and how the colony understood its place in a difficult and unpredictable world. Over time, Jamestown's early history became a foundational story within the broader narrative of English settlement in North America. The winter stood as a defining example of the challenges faced in establishing a new society in unfamiliar territory. It highlighted not only environmental difficulty, but also the importance of adaptation, cooperation, and endurance. As the colony continued forward, it carried both its achievements and its scars. Progress was real, but it was built upon a memory of near collapse. Stability was present, but it was always accompanied by awareness of how quickly it could be lost. And in that balance between growth and vulnerability, Jamestown's story continued to unfold, shaped forever by the winter that had tested it to its very limits and forced it to become something stronger than it had ever been before. As the years continued to pass, Jamestown gradually moved from a fragile survival settlement into a more established colonial center, though that transformation was neither smooth nor guaranteed. Every improvement in structure, economy, and governance carried with it the memory of earlier instability, and that memory continued to influence decisions long after the immediate crisis had faded. The colony's expansion outward from its original core settlement marked one of the clearest signs of its changing identity. What had once been a tightly confined area of survival began to spread into surrounding lands, where new farms, outposts, and work areas were gradually established. This expansion required not only labor, but also coordination, as distance introduced new challenges in communication, defense, and resource distribution. Even as more land was brought under cultivation, the lessons of the winter remained present in how expansion was managed. Settlers were more cautious about overextending themselves than they had been in the early years. Instead of rapidly claiming land without sufficient support systems, expansion now tended to follow more measured steps, with attention given to whether new areas could be sustained before further growth was attempted. This cautious approach reflected a deeper change in mindset. The colony was no longer driven primarily by the idea of quick reward or immediate transformation. Instead, it was increasingly shaped by the recognition that stability required long-term investment and patience. The memory of starvation had permanently altered expectations about how quickly success could be achieved. Governance within the colony also continued to evolve in response to these changing realities. Leadership structures became more defined, with clearer divisions of responsibility. Decision-making processes were increasingly based on practical necessity rather than personal influence or informal authority. While disagreements still occurred, they were more often resolved through structured negotiation rather than chaotic conflict. This growing organization did not eliminate tension entirely. The colony remained a complex environment where economic goals, survival needs, and external demands frequently overlapped. However, the presence of more stable systems helped reduce the likelihood of complete breakdowns like those experienced during the starving time. One of the most significant long-term developments during this period was the increasing importance of export agriculture. Tobacco, in particular, became deeply embedded in the colony's economy, shaping not only trade relationships, but also patterns of land use and labor distribution. Fields expanded further, and production methods became more specialized as demand increased. This economic shift brought both stability and new challenges. On one hand, it provided a reliable source of income that strengthened the colony's connection to global trade networks. On the other hand, it increased dependence on a single crop, making the colony vulnerable to fluctuations in demand, soil depletion, and labor demands that grew more intense over time. The relationship between land and labor became increasingly central to Jamestown's identity. As cultivation expanded, so too did the need for a consistent workforce capable of maintaining production across large areas. This demand influenced social and economic structures within the colony, shaping how land was distributed and how work was organized. At the same time, interactions with indigenous communities remained a critical aspect of colonial life. These relationships continued to shift depending on political conditions, resource availability, and broader regional dynamics. Trade remained essential in many periods, but trust remained fragile, shaped by earlier conflicts and competing interests. Both sides operated within a landscape where cooperation and tension existed side by side. Neither could fully ignore the other, yet neither could assume complete stability in their relationship. This ongoing complexity influenced everything from food supply to security planning, reinforcing the need for careful diplomacy. Inside the settlement itself, cultural memory of the early winter persisted in subtle but powerful ways. Even as new generations arrived who had not directly experienced the starvation period, they inherited its consequences through stories, practices, and institutional habits. Caution around food storage, emphasis on labor contribution, and attention to resource management became embedded norms rather than temporary responses. This inherited memory functioned almost like an invisible structure shaping behavior. It influenced how risk was perceived and how decisions were evaluated. Actions that might have seemed overly cautious to outsiders were understood internally as lessons grounded in lived experience. For newcomers arriving from England, this environment often felt different from what they had imagined. Expectations shaped by distant accounts of opportunity were frequently adjusted upon arrival. Instead of a frontier defined by abundance, they encountered a society defined by structure, labor, and a cautious awareness of how quickly conditions could deteriorate. Over time, however, these differences tended to diminish as individuals adapted to the realities of colonial life. Shared work, shared challenges, and shared dependence on the land gradually created a common understanding between established settlers and new arrivals. Despite its growth and increasing organization, Jamestown never became fully insulated from external risk. Disease outbreaks still occurred, sometimes spreading rapidly through concentrated populations. Weather events could still disrupt harvests. Supply chains from England remained vulnerable to delays and disruptions. The colony's stability, while improved, was always conditional rather than absolute. Yet compared to its earliest years, the transformation was undeniable. The settlement that had once come close to complete collapse during a brutal winter had developed systems capable of sustaining a growing population over time. Its survival was no longer a matter of chance alone, but of accumulated experience, adaptation, and institutional learning. The memory of the winter continued to function as a foundational reference point in this evolving society. It represented not just suffering, but also the turning point that forced the colony to change its approach to survival. It remained a reminder that progress in a new and unfamiliar land required more than ambition. It required resilience, structure, and an ongoing willingness to adapt. As Jamestown moved further into its future, the winter that once nearly ended it became part of its identity. It was a story of collapse narrowly avoided, of endurance under extreme pressure, and of a community forced to rebuild itself from the edge of disappearance. And in that story, the colony carried forward a lasting truth: that survival in the early years of settlement was never guaranteed, but once earned through hardship, it could become the foundation for something enduring. By this stage in Jamestown's history, the settlement was no longer defined solely by survival, but by the slow formation of a colonial society that was learning how to sustain itself across time. The harsh memory of the winter still lingered beneath everything, but it now operated more like a shadow in the background rather than an immediate threat. Life continued, yet it continued with an awareness that stability was something that had to be actively maintained, not passively assumed. The colony's growth brought new layers of complexity. As more settlers arrived over time, the population became more diverse in background, experience, and expectation. Some came with farming knowledge, others with trade skills, and many with little practical understanding of the environment they were entering. This mix of abilities required ongoing adaptation in how work was assigned and how responsibilities were distributed. Jamestown's leadership had to account for this changing population. Early leadership struggles had taught painful lessons about what happens when authority is fragmented or unclear. As a result, governance became increasingly structured, with more defined roles and expectations. While disagreements still occurred, they were now more likely to be resolved within established systems rather than escalating into full instability. The economy of the colony continued to evolve around agriculture, particularly tobacco, which increasingly shaped both daily life and long-term planning. Fields expanded further into surrounding land, and cultivation methods became more standardized. This growth created a stronger economic connection between the colony and transatlantic trade networks, linking Jamestown more closely to markets in England and beyond. However, this economic dependence also introduced a new kind of vulnerability. Success was no longer determined only by survival in the local environment, but also by demand, pricing, and policy decisions made across the ocean. The colony found itself navigating a dual reality, one shaped by land and labor, and another shaped by distant economic forces. At the same time, the physical expansion of farmland and settlements brought increasing pressure on the surrounding environment. Forests were cleared at a steady pace, altering local ecosystems and changing patterns of wildlife and soil use. These changes were not fully understood at the time, but they gradually influenced agricultural productivity and settlement patterns. Interactions with indigenous communities continued to play a significant role in shaping the colony's stability. These relationships were not static. They shifted in response to changing political conditions, resource availability, and regional alliances. Trade remained an important aspect of these interactions, but it was always balanced against periods of tension and uncertainty. Both sides operated within a landscape where long-term stability required careful management of relationships. Neither could assume consistent cooperation, yet neither could afford complete separation. This ongoing dynamic shaped not only trade, but also security, communication, and survival strategies across the region. Inside the colony, daily life reflected a growing sense of routine that had been absent in the earliest years. Work schedules became more predictable. Food production followed seasonal cycles that were increasingly understood and planned for. Shelter construction improved in durability, and storage systems became more reliable. Yet even in this more structured environment, the legacy of earlier hardship remained present. The memory of scarcity influenced how resources were managed. Food was still treated with caution, and surplus was often stored rather than immediately consumed. This behavior, shaped by past crisis, became embedded as a long-term cultural habit for those born into or arriving during this more stable phase. Jamestown appeared very different from the settlement described in older accounts. The most extreme moments of collapse and starvation were no longer part of daily experience, yet they remained part of collective memory, passed down through stories and warnings from earlier generations. This transmission of memory played an important role in shaping colonial identity. It reinforced the idea that stability was not guaranteed, and that the conditions of survival in a new land required continuous effort. In this sense, the winter that had nearly destroyed the colony continued to influence it long after its immediate effects had passed. Over time, Jamestown became more integrated into the broader structure of English colonial expansion. It was no longer an isolated experiment struggling for existence, but part of a growing network of settlements, trade routes, and administrative systems. This integration brought additional support, but also additional expectations, particularly regarding economic output and governance. Despite these developments, the colony never fully escaped the uncertainties of its environment. Disease, weather, and supply disruptions remained constant risks. Even as systems improved, they could never eliminate unpredictability entirely. The settlement's stability was always conditional, built on layers of adaptation rather than permanent security. Still, compared to its earliest years, the transformation was profound. What had once been a fragile outpost on the edge of collapse had become a functioning colonial settlement with structured governance, expanding economy, and established routines. The difference between those two states was measured not only in growth, but in resilience gained through hardship. The winter that had once defined Jamestown's most desperate moment now served as a foundational reference point in its long-term development. It shaped decisions, influenced behavior, and reminded every generation that survival in a new world was never automatic. It had to be built, maintained, and defended through constant effort. And as Jamestown continued forward, that lesson remained at its core, quiet but unshakable, embedded in the history of a colony that had once stood on the edge of disappearance and learned, through suffering, how to endure. As Jamestown continued to stabilize and expand, the colony entered a phase where survival was no longer the central daily crisis, but uncertainty never fully disappeared. The settlement had grown into something more permanent, yet it still existed in a world where every advantage had to be maintained through constant effort. The memory of the winter remained present, not as an immediate fear, but as a quiet reminder embedded in how people planned, worked, and made decisions. The physical growth of the colony became more visible during this period. Fields stretched farther from the original settlement, and small clusters of habitation began appearing beyond the central area. What had once been a tightly contained outpost now had the beginnings of a wider network of activity. This expansion reflected both increasing population and the growing importance of agriculture as the backbone of the colony's survival and economic function. With expansion came new organizational challenges. Transporting goods, coordinating labor, and maintaining communication across larger distances required more structured systems than before. Roads and pathways, initially informal, became more intentionally used and maintained. The colony was gradually developing the basic infrastructure needed to support a larger, more complex society. Leadership adapted once again to these changing conditions. Decision-making increasingly focused on long-term planning rather than immediate crisis response. While emergencies still occurred, they were no longer the defining feature of governance. Instead, attention shifted towards sustainability, how to ensure food production remained consistent, how to manage land use effectively, and how to maintain stability across a growing population. The economy of Jamestown continued to deepen its reliance on agricultural production, especially tobacco, which increasingly shaped not only trade, but also social organization. Land ownership and cultivation became central to status and influence within the colony. Those who controlled productive land held significant economic power, which in turn influenced political decisions and labor arrangements. This growing emphasis on land and production introduced new structural dynamics within the colony. Workforces expanded, and labor expectations became more formalized. The need for continuous cultivation meant that time, effort, and resources were increasingly directed toward maintaining output rather than exploratory or experimental activities. At the same time, the colony's relationship with indigenous communities remained an essential and complex part of regional life. Trade continued in various forms, often shaped by immediate needs and shifting alliances. While periods of cooperation provided essential resources, tensions still emerged due to competition over land, resources, and influence. These interactions reflected a broader reality of the region. Stability was not absolute for any group involved. Both settlers and native communities were navigating changing conditions, and their relationships evolved accordingly. At times, this meant collaboration, and at other times, conflict or cautious separation. Inside Jamestown, daily life became more structured and predictable compared to earlier years. Work routines followed seasonal patterns with increasing consistency. Agricultural cycles dictated much of the colony's rhythm, and survival became less about emergency response and more about maintaining steady production across time. Even so, the psychological imprint of the early winter did not fade. It continued to influence behavior in subtle ways. Resource management remained cautious, storage practices were careful, and waste was minimized whenever possible. These habits, formed during crisis, became long-term norms that helped reinforce stability. New generations growing up in the colony inherited both the physical improvements and the historical memory of earlier hardship. While they did not experience the starving time directly, they grew up in a society shaped by its consequences. Stories of near collapse served as cautionary narratives, reinforcing the importance of discipline, cooperation, and preparation. For newcomers arriving from England, Jamestown increasingly appeared as a functioning, if demanding, colonial settlement. The contrast between expectation and reality remained significant. Many arrived expecting opportunity defined by ease or rapid success, only to encounter a structured environment where labor and adaptation were essential. Over time, however, these expectations adjusted. New settlers learned to operate within the established systems of the colony, and in doing so, they became part of its ongoing transformation. The tension between expectation and reality gradually softened, replaced by participation in the colony's existing rhythm. Despite its increasing stability, Jamestown remained dependent on external factors beyond its control. Weather patterns could still disrupt harvests, disease could still spread, and supply lines from England remained vulnerable to delay or interruption. The colony's security was therefore never absolute, even as its systems improved. This ongoing vulnerability reinforced the importance of the structures developed in response to earlier crises. The winter had taught that collapse could happen quickly and without warning. As a result, every improvement in governance, agriculture, and infrastructure carried the implicit goal of preventing a return to that level of instability. As Jamestown moved further into its development, it became increasingly clear that its early survival was not just a moment in history, but the foundation upon which everything else had been built. The systems that emerged later were shaped directly by the experience of crisis. And without that experience, the colony might not have developed the same level of resilience. In this way, the winter remained central to Jamestown's identity, even as time passed. It was no longer an active threat, but it continued to define the colony's understanding of itself and its environment. It served as a reminder that progress in a new land was never guaranteed, and that stability required constant attention. And so, as the colony continued to grow and adapt, it carried forward both its achievements and its history of survival. The early years of struggle remained woven into its foundations, shaping not only how it had endured the past, but how it would face the uncertain future ahead. As Jamestown entered yet another stage of its development, the settlement had begun to feel less like a temporary experiment and more like a structured, evolving society. Yet, even with this transformation, it was still defined by its origins. The early winter, the starvation, and the fragile years that followed continued to influence how the colony operated beneath the surface of its growing stability. Expansion continued outward in gradual, deliberate steps. New land was cleared for farming, and small settlements connected to the main colony began to appear along useful waterways and fertile areas. These outlying zones were not independent communities, but extensions of Jamestown's growing agricultural system. Their purpose was simple: increase production, secure resources, and support the central settlement. This outward movement required more coordination than before. As distances increased, communication became more important, and the colony slowly developed more structured ways of organizing labor and distributing supplies. What had once been a compact settlement where everyone operated within sight of one another was now becoming a wider network that demanded planning and oversight. The agricultural foundation of the colony continued to deepen, especially through tobacco cultivation, which remained the most important economic driver. Fields expanded further, and the crop became more deeply integrated into both trade and daily labor routines. Tobacco was no longer just an export product. It had become a defining element of the colony's structure and priorities. This increasing reliance on a single major crop created a stronger connection between Jamestown and external markets. Demand abroad influenced production decisions at home, linking the colony's internal rhythms to distant economic forces. While this brought greater financial stability, it also meant that the colony's prosperity was no longer entirely self-contained. Within this system, land became one of the most important sources of influence and organization. Control over fertile areas directly shaped economic standing and social position. As more land was cultivated, questions of ownership, allocation, and labor responsibility became increasingly central to the colony's internal structure. Leadership continued to evolve in response to these changes. Authority was now more closely associated with the ability to manage production, maintain order, and navigate both internal and external pressures. The earlier instability of leadership structures had gradually given way to a more defined system, shaped by experience and necessity. Even so, governance remained a balancing act. Leaders had to respond to immediate agricultural demands while also considering long-term sustainability. They had to manage relationships with external groups while maintaining internal cohesion. And underlying all of these responsibilities was the constant awareness that the colony's stability had once been fragile enough to collapse entirely. That memory influenced decision-making in subtle but persistent ways. Policies regarding food storage, labor organization, and resource management continued to reflect lessons learned during the winter years. Even as conditions improved, caution remained a defining characteristic of the colony's approach to risk. The population of Jamestown also became more diverse over time. New settlers brought different skills, expectations, and experiences, contributing to a more complex social environment. Some adapted quickly to the structured demands of colonial life, while others struggled with the realities of labor-intensive survival systems. This mixture of backgrounds required ongoing adjustment. Established settlers, shaped by earlier hardship, often viewed newcomers through the lens of experience. New arrivals, in turn, had to adapt to systems that were already shaped by years of trial, error, and survival-driven adaptation. Over time, these groups gradually integrated, though not without friction. Trade and interaction with indigenous communities continued to play a vital role in the colony's existence. These relationships were shaped by shifting circumstances, including resource availability, political alliances, and regional pressures. At times, cooperation provided essential support for survival and growth. At other times, tensions reflected competing interests and unresolved conflicts. These interactions were not static, but evolved alongside the colony itself. As Jamestown expanded and its economic systems strengthened, its position within the region became more complex. It was no longer a fragile newcomer dependent solely on external assistance, but a growing settlement with its own influence and needs. Despite this growth, the colony never escaped vulnerability. Disease outbreaks, environmental fluctuations, and disruptions in transatlantic supply routes continued to pose risks. Stability was always conditional, never absolute. Even in periods of relative prosperity, the possibility of disruption remained present. This tension between growth and uncertainty defined much of Jamestown's development. Progress was real, but it was layered over a history of instability that could not be forgotten. Every improvement carried with it the implicit understanding that conditions could change again. As the colony matured, the memory of the early winter remained one of its most important historical foundations. It was not simply a story of suffering, but a formative experience that shaped how the settlement understood survival, cooperation, and long-term planning. It influenced both institutional structures and cultural attitudes, embedding itself into the identity of the colony. Over time, Jamestown became part of a larger colonial system that extended beyond its original boundaries. It contributed to broader patterns of settlement, trade, and governance that defined the region. Yet, even within this expanding framework, its early history remained distinctive. The winter that once threatened to erase the colony had become a defining element of its legacy. It marked the point at which ambition collided with reality, forcing adaptation that would shape everything that followed. Without it, the colony might have remained fragile and short-lived. With it, it developed the resilience needed to endure. However, this stability did not eliminate the memory of earlier vulnerability. The experience of near collapse during the winter remained deeply embedded in the collective mindset. It influenced how risks were assessed and how resources were managed. Even in times of abundance, caution remained a defining characteristic of the colony's behavior. This cultural memory persisted across generations. Those who had lived through the worst periods passed down their experiences to newer settlers, ensuring that the lessons of scarcity and survival were not forgotten. In this way, the winter functioned not just as a historical event, but as an ongoing influence on how the colony understood itself. New arrivals from England continued to reshape the social fabric of Jamestown. Each group brought new expectations and skills, but also had to adapt to the established systems already in place. Over time, this created a blending of perspectives, though not without friction. The tension between expectation and reality remained a recurring theme in colonial life. Interactions with indigenous communities also remained a critical aspect of the region's dynamics. These relationships continued to shift in response to changing conditions, including resource availability, political developments, and shifting alliances. Trade, diplomacy, and conflict all played roles in shaping the broader environment in which Jamestown existed. Neither side could be understood in isolation from the other. The colony's survival and growth were tied in part to these interactions, just as indigenous communities navigated the presence and expansion of English settlement within their territories. The relationship was complex, fluid, and shaped by circumstances that evolved over time. Despite its increasing stability, Jamestown remained exposed to external risks. Disease outbreaks could still spread rapidly. Weather patterns could still disrupt agricultural output. Supply chains from across the Atlantic could still fail or be delayed. The colony's progress reduced vulnerability, but it never eliminated it entirely. What defined this later stage of Jamestown's development was not the absence of danger, but the presence of systems designed to manage it. The colony had learned, through years of difficulty, how to respond more effectively to challenges that once threatened its existence. The winter that had nearly destroyed the settlement remained the defining reference point for this transformation. It represented the moment when the colony was forced to confront the limits of its preparation and the consequences of its assumptions. From that moment forward, every improvement carried the imprint of that experience. In the end, Jamestown's story during this period was not simply one of survival, but of adaptation shaped by memory. It was a reminder that progress in an unfamiliar world was not linear, but built upon cycles of crisis and recovery. The colony's stability was not inherited. It was earned through hardship and sustained through constant effort. And as Jamestown continued to move forward into an uncertain future, It did so carrying the quiet but unshakable knowledge that its existence had once hung by a thread, and that it endured only because it learned how to change. As Jamestown moved deeper into its later development, the colony's identity became increasingly layered, shaped by both its expanding ambitions and the long shadow of its earliest suffering. The settlement was no longer defined by emergency survival, yet it never fully escaped the mindset that had been forged during its most desperate years. Even prosperity carried caution within it. By this stage, the colony had developed a more stable rhythm of life, closely tied to agricultural cycles and trade demands. Planting seasons, harvest periods, and shipping schedules from England formed a predictable structure that guided much of daily activity. This regularity gave the settlement a sense of order that had been absent in its earliest decades. However, this order was not effortless. It depended on coordination across many moving parts, labor forces in the fields, transport along rivers, storage management within the settlement, and communication with distant markets. A disruption in any one of these areas could still create ripple effects throughout the colony. The expansion of cultivated land continued, though now with greater awareness of sustainability and productivity. Early mistakes, such as overextending fields without adequate labor or misjudging soil capacity, had taught harsh lessons. As a result, land use became more strategic, with attention given to long-term yield rather than immediate gain alone. Tobacco remained the central economic force, deeply embedded in the colony's structure. Its cultivation influenced settlement patterns, labor organization, and trade relationships. As production increased, so did the colony's reliance on external markets, reinforcing its integration into the broader Atlantic economy. This integration brought both strength and dependency. On one hand, it provided access to goods, capital, and political attention from England. On the other, it tied the colony's success to forces far beyond its immediate control. Prices, demand, and policy decisions made overseas could directly influence conditions in Jamestown. Within the settlement, social structures continued to evolve alongside economic changes. As land ownership and production output became more important, distinctions between individuals became more defined. Those with access to larger or more productive plots held greater influence, while others worked within systems shaped by these hierarchies. Despite these divisions, the colony still retained elements of collective memory shaped by earlier survival. The experience of the winter and the fragility it revealed continued to function as a quiet equalizer in the background of society. It reminded everyone, regardless of status, that conditions could shift rapidly and unpredictably. Governance adapted to these layered realities. Leadership was increasingly focused on maintaining balance between production and sustainability, between local needs and external demands, and between growth and stability. Decisions were rarely simple and often required weighing immediate benefits against long-term consequences. Administrative systems became more refined over time. Records, planning, and coordination improved as the colony matured. While still limited by the constraints of the era, these systems helped reduce the level of improvisation that had characterized earlier years. Daily life in Jamestown reflected this gradual stabilization. Work routines were more predictable, food supplies more reliable, and seasonal planning more effective. The extreme uncertainty of the early settlement years had been replaced by a structured environment where survival was no longer constantly in question. Yet even in this improved condition, the colony remained aware of its vulnerability. Disease outbreaks could still disrupt communities. Harsh weather could still damage crops. Supply interruptions could still create shortages. Stability existed, but it was always conditional. This awareness shaped the cultural mindset of the settlement. Caution was not simply a reaction to past hardship. It became a long-term habit embedded in how people thought about resources, planning, and risk. The winter had left behind not only memory, but methodology. New generations born or raised within the colony inherited this mindset indirectly. They learned through stories, practices, and institutional behavior that survival in this environment required discipline and preparation. Even without experiencing the worst years firsthand, they lived within systems built in response to them. At the same time, the colony continued to grow in complexity. Increased population brought greater diversity of experience and expectation. Some settlers focused on agriculture, others on trade, and others on administrative roles. This specialization contributed to greater efficiency, but also introduced new layers of interdependence. Relations with indigenous communities remained an important and evolving aspect of regional life. These interactions continued to shift based on changing political conditions, resource needs, and broader colonial expansion. Trade, negotiation, and occasional conflict all played roles in shaping the balance between communities in the region. These relationships were never static. They reflected a dynamic environment in which both settlers and indigenous groups were responding to changing pressures. Cooperation at times provided essential support, while tension at other times reflected competing priorities and interests. Despite its growth, Jamestown remained part of a larger system still subject to external influence. Policies from England, shifts in transatlantic trade, and broader geopolitical developments all had the potential to affect the colony's stability. It was no longer isolated, but it was not fully autonomous either. What distinguished this later stage of Jamestown's development was its ability to function within these constraints. The colony had learned how to operate under conditions of uncertainty without collapsing under pressure. This capability was not present in its earliest years, when even small disruptions could trigger crisis. The transformation was gradual but profound. From a fragile settlement on the edge of collapse, Jamestown had become a functioning colonial society with systems capable of sustaining growth over time. This change was not the result of a single event, but of accumulated experience shaped heavily by its earliest hardships. The winter that had once nearly erased the colony remained central to its identity. It was the turning point that forced adaptation and redefined what survival meant in this environment. Its influence persisted long after the immediate danger had passed, shaping decisions, habits, and expectations across generations. In reflecting on this period, Jamestown's story becomes one of endurance built through transformation. It demonstrates how a society can emerge from extreme vulnerability not by avoiding hardship, but by adapting to it and learning from it in ways that reshape its foundations. And as the colony continued forward, expanding its reach and deepening its systems, it carried with it the enduring truth born from its earliest winter: that survival is never guaranteed, but those who learn from collapse can build something that lasts beyond it. As Jamestown continued to mature into a more established colonial settlement, its earlier identity as a fragile survival experiment faded further into the background of daily life. Yet the foundation beneath everything, the memory of collapse, hunger, and near abandonment, remained embedded in how the colony functioned. It was no longer spoken about constantly, but it shaped decisions in ways that were deeply structural. By this point, the settlement had developed a clearer sense of permanence. Buildings were more durable, storage systems more reliable, and agricultural output more consistent than in earlier decades. The colony was no longer operating in a state of constant emergency, and that shift alone marked a significant transformation from its earliest existence. However, permanence did not mean simplicity. As Jamestown expanded, the systems required to sustain it grew more complex. Agriculture, trade, labor, and governance were no longer separate or loosely connected activities. They had become interdependent systems, each influencing the others in ways that required coordination and planning. Land use remained at the center of this evolving structure. The expansion of cultivated fields continued, but now it was guided by accumulated experience rather than trial and error alone. Soil quality, drainage conditions, and seasonal patterns were increasingly taken into account when determining where and how to expand production. This more informed approach reduced some of the inefficiencies that had previously contributed to instability. At the same time, it also reinforced the importance of land as a core economic and social asset. Control over productive areas remained a major source of influence within the colony. shaping both wealth distribution and political authority. Tobacco continued to dominate the colony's economic life, anchoring its participation in Atlantic trade networks. Its cultivation shaped not only economic output, but also labor organization and settlement expansion. As demand grew, so too did the pressure to increase production, which influenced nearly every aspect of colonial planning. This reliance on a single major export created a paradox within the colony's development. On one hand, it provided the financial stability needed to sustain growth and import necessary goods. On the other, it tied the colony's prosperity to external markets that it could not control. This dependence introduced a different kind of vulnerability than the physical scarcity of the early years, but it was vulnerability nonetheless. Within Jamestown itself, social organization became more structured over time. As economic roles became more specialized, distinctions between groups became more defined. Landowners, laborers, traders, and administrators occupied different positions within the colony's hierarchy, each contributing to its overall function in different ways. Despite these distinctions, the shared history of hardship continued to act as a unifying background influence. The memory of the winter years remained part of the colony's collective identity, even as new generations grew up far removed from its direct experience. It functioned as a historical reference point that shaped attitudes toward risk, planning, and survival. Leadership structures reflected this layered reality. Governance was no longer solely reactive, but increasingly focused on maintaining long-term stability. Decisions were made with greater attention to sustainability, resource management, and coordination between different sectors of colonial life. Administrative practices improved gradually. Record-keeping became more consistent, planning more deliberate, and communication more structured. While still limited by the technological and logistical constraints of the time, these improvements contributed to a more predictable and manageable system of governance. Daily life in the colony followed this increasing regularity. Work routines were aligned with seasonal cycles. Food production was more reliably organized, and storage systems helped reduce the risk of sudden shortages. The extreme uncertainty that had defined the earliest years of Jamestown had largely been replaced by structured continuity. Yet beneath this stability remained an awareness that conditions could change. Disease, outbreaks, environmental fluctuations, and disruptions in transatlantic supply routes all continued to pose risks. The colony's systems were stronger than before, but they were not immune to disruption. This awareness shaped behavior across all levels of society. Planning tended to include contingencies. Resources were managed with caution. Surplus was often preserved rather than immediately consumed. These habits reflected not only rational planning, but also inherited memory from earlier periods of crisis. New settlers entering this environment often encountered a society already shaped by these long-term experiences. Expectations formed abroad did not always match the realities of colonial life. Adjustment was necessary, and over time, most newcomers adapted to the structured systems they found upon arrival. This process of adaptation contributed to a gradual blending of perspectives. Established settlers brought experience shaped by hardship, while new arrivals contributed different skills and ideas. The interaction between these groups helped sustain the colony's continued development. Relations with indigenous communities remained an essential and evolving part of the regional landscape. These interactions continued to shift over time, influenced by trade needs, territorial pressures, and broader political developments. Cooperation, negotiation, and conflict all occurred at different moments, reflecting the complexity of coexistence in the region. Neither side operated in isolation. Both were responding to changing conditions, and both had to adapt strategies based on shifting realities. This dynamic environment required constant adjustment and reinforced the importance of diplomacy alongside survival and economic planning as Jamestown moved further into its later development. Its identity became increasingly defined by its ability to persist through uncertainty. It was no longer a settlement defined by a single crisis, but by a long history of adaptation in response to changing conditions. The winter that had nearly ended the colony remained a defining moment in that history. It was the point at which the limits of preparation were exposed, forcing a transformation in how the settlement approached survival. Its impact continued to shape the colony long after the immediate danger had passed. In the broader arc of Jamestown's development, this period represents a transition from fragile existence to structured endurance. The colony did not become immune to hardship, but it became more capable of responding to it without collapse. And as it continued forward, expanding its reach and deepening its systems, Jamestown carried with it the enduring lesson born from its earliest winter. That survival is not a single achievement secured once, but an ongoing process maintained through adaptation, discipline, and the memory of what happens when those things fail. As Jamestown entered yet another stage of its long development, the settlement had become something its earliest founders would have struggled to recognize. What began as a fragile foothold on unfamiliar land had gradually transformed into a structured colonial society shaped by agriculture, trade, and hard-earned experience. Yet, beneath this outward stability, the colony still carried the deep imprint of its earliest years, especially the winter that had once brought it to the edge of extinction. By now, daily life in Jamestown followed a rhythm that felt increasingly established. Agricultural cycles dictated the flow of work. Trade ships provided periodic connection to England, and internal systems of governance ensured that responsibilities were more clearly distributed than in the past. The settlement was no longer improvising its survival from one crisis to the next. Instead, it was maintaining a structure built over years of adaptation. Even so, this structure remained dependent on constant maintenance. The colony's success was not the result of a single breakthrough, but of repeated adjustments made in response to both success and failure. Fields had to be managed carefully, labor organized consistently, and resources monitored with attention to seasonal variation. Stability in this environment was always active rather than passive. Agriculture continued to expand as the foundation of the colony's existence. The experience of earlier shortages had permanently changed how farming was approached. Instead of relying on uncertain experimentation, settlers increasingly followed established patterns that had proven effective over time. Crop planning became more deliberate, and the importance of maintaining soil productivity was better understood. Tobacco remained the dominant economic force, shaping not only trade, but also the physical and social landscape of the colony. Its cultivation influenced settlement patterns as land was increasingly organized around production efficiency. Fields extended outward, and the colony's footprint grew accordingly, tying its development directly to the demands of export agriculture. This expansion strengthened Jamestown's connection to broader Atlantic trade networks. Ships arriving from England brought goods, supplies, and new settlers, while returning vessels carried agricultural products that sustained the colony's economic relevance. This exchange created a continuous link between local production and distant markets, embedding the colony within a wider global system. However, this connection also introduced new dependencies. The colony's stability was no longer determined solely by its ability to produce food locally, but also by fluctuations in demand, shipping schedules, and political decisions made far away. This layered dependence created a form of vulnerability different from the physical scarcity of earlier years, but still significant in shaping colonial life. Within the settlement, social organization continued to develop in response to economic realities. As production systems became more structured, roles within the colony became more specialized. Agricultural workers, landholders, traders, and administrators each occupied distinct positions within a growing hierarchy shaped by access to resources and control over production. Despite these divisions, the shared memory of early hardship continued to act as a subtle, unifying force. The experience of near collapse during the winter years remained embedded in the colony's identity, influencing attitudes toward risk, resource management, and long-term planning. Even as new generations grew up far removed from those events, the legacy of that period continued to shape expectations. Governance reflected this accumulated experience. Decision-making processes became more formalized, with increased emphasis on planning, coordination, and record-keeping. Leaders were expected not only to respond to immediate issues, but also to anticipate future challenges based on past experience. This shift marked a significant departure from the colony's earliest years, when leadership was often reactive and fragmented. Over time, authority became more stable and structured, allowing for more consistent management of both internal affairs and external relationships. Relations with indigenous communities remained an essential and evolving aspect of the colony's environment. These interactions were shaped by shifting political conditions, resource needs, and regional dynamics. At various times, they involved trade, negotiation, and conflict, reflecting the complexity of coexistence in a shared and changing landscape. Neither side existed in isolation. Each was responding to broader pressures that influenced decisions and relationships. This dynamic created a constantly evolving balance where cooperation and tension could alternate depending on circumstances. Despite its growth, Jamestown remained exposed to external risks that could not be fully controlled. Disease outbreaks, environmental fluctuations, and disruptions in transatlantic supply lines continued to pose challenges. The colony had become more resilient, but it was never fully secure. This ongoing uncertainty reinforced the importance of the systems developed over time. Agricultural planning, resource management, and governance structures all functioned as safeguards against instability. They did not eliminate risk, but they reduced the likelihood that individual disruptions would lead to total collapse. The memory of the winter remained central to this approach. It served as a permanent reminder of what had once been possible when preparation failed and conditions turned against the colony. That memory influenced not only practical decisions, but also the broader mindset of the settlement. In this way, Jamestown's history became layered. The present was shaped by systems built for stability, but those systems were themselves shaped by past vulnerability. The colony's identity was therefore not fixed, but continuously formed through the interaction between memory and experience. As time moved forward, Jamestown increasingly represented not just a settlement, but a process of adaptation unfolding over generations. It demonstrated how a community could evolve in response to extreme hardship, gradually transforming crisis into structure and uncertainty into endurance. And although the winter that once nearly destroyed it receded further into history, its influence remained embedded in every field, every decision, and every system that allowed the colony to continue forward into an uncertain future with a hard-earned measure of stability. By this later stage in Jamestown's development, the settlement had firmly transitioned into a long-term colonial presence, but its stability was never something that could be taken for granted. It existed in a constant balance between growth and risk, shaped by both the systems it had built and the environment it continued to depend on. The memory of the early winter still lingered beneath this structure, influencing how the colony understood itself and its limits. The expansion of cultivated land had now become an established feature of Jamestown's landscape. Fields extended outward in organized patterns, reflecting years of accumulated agricultural knowledge. What had once been experimental and uncertain farming practices had gradually evolved into structured systems designed to maximize yield while maintaining sustainability. This agricultural foundation remained the backbone of the colony's survival. Every other aspect of life, trade, governance, settlement expansion, ultimately depended on the success of these fields. As a result, farming was not just an economic activity, but the core organizing principle of the colony's existence. Tobacco continued to dominate production and trade, reinforcing Jamestown's position within a growing Atlantic economy. Its importance extended beyond simple export value. It shaped labor distribution, land ownership patterns, and even the direction of settlement growth. Entire areas of land were organized around its cultivation, making it both an economic resource and a structural influence on colonial life. This deep reliance on a single crop created a system that was both productive and vulnerable. While tobacco provided consistent economic returns and strengthened ties to external markets, it also tied the colony's fortunes to global demand and external trade conditions. Success, in one sense, brought dependence in another. Within the settlement, population growth contributed to increasing complexity. More settlers meant greater diversity in skills, backgrounds, and expectations. This diversity supported expansion, but also required more structured systems of coordination. Work assignments, resource distribution, and administrative responsibilities became more formalized in response to this growing population. Social organization reflected the evolving economic structure of the colony. As land and production became central to wealth and influence, distinctions between different groups became more pronounced. Those who controlled productive land or managed key aspects of trade held greater authority within the colony's internal hierarchy. Despite these developments, the shared memory of early hardship continued to influence the colony's identity. The winter that had nearly destroyed Jamestown remained a defining reference point, shaping attitudes toward risk, preparation, and resource management. Even as new generations grew up in a more stable environment, they inherited systems built in response to that earlier crisis. Governance continued to mature alongside these changes. Decision-making processes became increasingly structured, with greater emphasis on planning and coordination. Leaders were expected to manage both immediate concerns and long-term stability, balancing local needs with external expectations from England. This balancing act became a defining feature of colonial administration. Jamestown was no longer an isolated settlement struggling for survival, but part of a larger imperial system with economic and political obligations. These obligations influenced nearly every aspect of governance, from production targets to settlement expansion policies. At the same time, the colony's internal systems became more resilient. Lessons learned from earlier instability had been incorporated into administrative practices. Resource management was more cautious, agricultural planning more informed, and labor organization more consistent. These improvements reduced the likelihood of sudden collapse, even if they could not eliminate risk entirely. Interactions with indigenous communities remained an important and evolving part of the region's dynamics. These relationships continued to shift in response to changing conditions, including resource availability, territorial expansion, and broader political developments. Trade, negotiation, and conflict all played roles in shaping this ongoing relationship. Both sides operated within a shared environment that required constant adaptation. Neither could ignore the presence of the other, and both had to respond to shifting circumstances as they arose. This created a complex and often unstable balance that influenced life across the region. Daily life in Jamestown reflected the increasing regularity of its systems. Agricultural cycles, trade schedules, and administrative routines provided structure to the colony's rhythm. While challenges still occurred, they were more often managed within existing systems rather than escalating into existential crises. However, beneath this structure remained a persistent awareness of vulnerability. Disease outbreaks, environmental fluctuations, and disruptions in supply chains could still affect the colony significantly. Stability, while improved, remained conditional and dependent on continued effort and coordination. This awareness shaped both behavior and mindset. Planning often included contingency measures. Resources were stored carefully. Labor was organized with attention to seasonal variation. These practices reflected not only rational strategy, but also inherited memory from earlier periods of extreme scarcity. The winter that had once nearly ended the colony continued to function as a foundational reference point in this evolving system. It influenced not only how the past was remembered, but also how the present was managed. Its lessons had become embedded in the structure of the colony itself. Over time, Jamestown's development came to represent a broader process of adaptation and institutional learning. It demonstrated how a settlement could move from fragility to relative stability through repeated cycles of crisis and recovery. Each phase of development built upon the lessons of the previous one. In this sense, the colony's history was not a straight path forward, but a layered accumulation of experience. The systems that supported its later stability were directly shaped by earlier moments of failure and near collapse. Without those experiences, the structure of the colony would have been fundamentally different. And as Jamestown continued into its future, it carried with it this dual legacy of hardship endured and stability achieved, bound together in a history that had transformed suffering into structure and survival into continuity. By the final stage of Jamestown's early colonial development, the settlement stood as something far removed from its first fragile days on the Virginia shoreline. The harsh winter that had once pushed it to the edge of collapse was no longer an immediate memory for most of its population. Yet its influence remained deeply embedded in every system that allowed the colony to function. It had become part of the foundation rather than just part of the past. The colony's structure now reflected years of adaptation. Agriculture formed the core of its existence, with organized fields stretching outward from the original settlement. What had once been scattered attempts at survival farming had evolved into a more deliberate and sustained system of production. The land was no longer seen as an uncertain wilderness alone, but as a managed resource that required careful planning and long-term thinking. Tobacco remained the central force shaping Jamestown's economy and identity. It was more than a crop, it was the engine that connected the colony to distant markets, shaped patterns of settlement, and influenced nearly every aspect of labor organization. The success of tobacco cultivation brought wealth and expansion, but it also tied the colony to external forces beyond its control, making it dependent on trade networks that stretched across the Atlantic. This dependence created a complex balance. On one hand, Jamestown had achieved a level of economic integration that ensured its continued relevance within the wider colonial system. On the other hand, that same integration meant that its stability was linked not only to local conditions, but also to distant economic decisions, market fluctuations, and political priorities in England. Within the settlement, social and economic structures had become more defined over time. Land ownership, production output, and control over resources played a significant role in shaping influence and authority. The earlier fluidity of survival-based equality had gradually given way to a more structured hierarchy shaped by economic function. Yet even within this more stratified system, the shared history of hardship remained an underlying force that connected the community. The memory of the winter of hunger, cold, and near abandonment was not simply a story from the past. It functioned as a collective lesson embedded in how the colony understood risk, planning, and survival. It reminded every generation, directly or indirectly, that stability had once been nearly lost. Governance reflected this accumulated experience. Leadership was no longer purely reactive, but increasingly focused on long-term stability and coordination. Systems of administration, record-keeping, and planning became more structured, allowing the colony to function with greater predictability than in its earliest years. Decisions were made with attention to both immediate needs and future consequences. This evolution in governance marked a significant transformation from the colony's beginnings, when uncertainty and fragmentation often defined decision-making. Now, even in the face of challenges, there were established mechanisms to respond without descending into complete disorder. Daily life in Jamestown had settled into a rhythm shaped by agricultural cycles, trade schedules, and administrative organization. While difficulties still arose, they were more often managed within existing systems rather than escalating into existential crises. The colony had developed the capacity not just to survive, but to sustain itself over time. However, this stability was never absolute. Disease, weather, and disruptions in transatlantic supply routes continued to pose risks. The colony remained vulnerable in ways that could not be fully eliminated. Its progress reduced the likelihood of collapse, but it did not remove uncertainty from its existence. This ongoing tension between stability and vulnerability became a defining feature of Jamestown's identity. The systems that supported its survival were constantly shaped by awareness of what had once gone wrong. The winter that nearly ended the colony was not just a historical event. It was a permanent reference point that influenced how the settlement operated at every level. Relations with indigenous communities continued to be a crucial and complex part of the colony's environment. These interactions were shaped by shifting conditions, including resource availability, territorial expansion, and changing alliances. Trade, negotiation, and conflict all played roles in shaping the region's dynamics. Neither side existed in isolation, and both had to navigate a landscape of constant change. As Jamestown expanded and matured, it became part of a broader colonial framework. Its systems, economy, and governance were increasingly integrated into larger patterns of English expansion. This integration brought support and structure, but also new expectations and pressures that influenced nearly every aspect of colonial life. Despite all these developments, the most enduring aspect of Jamestown's story remained its early struggle. The winter that once threatened its existence had become the defining moment in its history. It represented the point at which the colony was forced to confront the limits of its preparation and the reality of its environment. From that moment forward, everything that followed was shaped by the need to ensure that such a collapse would not happen again. In the end, Jamestown's journey from fragile settlement to enduring colony was not a story of uninterrupted success, but of repeated adaptation under pressure. It was a process of learning through hardship, building systems in response to failure, and gradually transforming instability into structure. And as the colony moved forward beyond its earliest and most dangerous years, it carried with it a lasting truth forged in that terrible winter. Survival in a new world was never guaranteed by hope alone. It was secured only through endurance, adaptation, and the willingness to change in order to remain alive. That lesson born in hunger and cold, became the quiet foundation of everything Jamestown would go on to become.